Welcome to the Indie Writer Podcast, where we talk about all things writing and indie publishing. Today we are excited to talk about horror retellings with Adam McOmber. Adam McOmber is the author of 3 novels, The White Forest, Jesus and John, and The Ghost Finders, as well as 3 collections of short stories, My House Gathers Desires, This New and Poisonous Air, and Fantasy Kit. He is a core faculty member in the writing program at Vermont College of Fine Arts, as well as editor-in-chief of the literary magazine Hunger Mountain. Welcome, Adam. I'm so excited to have you.
Hey, guys. It's great to be here.
Also joined by co-host Becca, Spence, Dobias today. And we're just going to dive in a little bit. Adam, I guess to introduce yourself to our audience, could you tell us a little bit about your upcoming book, The Hound of the Baskervilles, and why you chose to retell this story? And maybe just a little overview of the original story and your retelling.
Yeah, for sure. My new novel, it is called Hound of the Baskervilles. So there's no the. The Hound of the Baskervilles is the Arthur Conan Doyle version. So it sets mine, apart. It's almost the same title. But why I wanted to retell it, it has always been a favorite thing of mine. I love kind of occult mystery, supernatural mystery, and even though Conan Doyle's is not supernatural in the end, I don't know, it's always excited me since I was a kid, and I find myself kind of going back to a lot of that imaginative fiction that I read as a kid, and wanting to do something with it. So this was my my take on Hound of the Baskervilles, which is supernatural in my version, and is weird with a capital W, queer, and unabashedly erotic, I will say.
And I've had the pleasure to read it, and it was fantastic. And I also had yeah, you should. It's great. And I also had the pleasure to read another book of yours, Jesus and John, which is a retelling as well, but of a biblical story. And so I'm really excited to have you on this episode. What do you think it is about retellings in general that speak to you?
So I think I have that kind of like postmodern impulse where I want to mess with things. So even when I'm not doing a direct retelling, like, the story of the resurrection or Hound of the Baskervilles, I'm still doing versions of retelling. So I'll take maybe Gothic, a Gothic romance, and I'll put my own spin on it. Or I'll do, play with the tropes of science fiction, things like that. So I like to have a set of toys out in front of me when I write, and I like to play with those toys. That it just excites me. That I think is why.
So I was going to ask, when you're saying that Conan Doyle's is not supernatural and yours is, and then also you're making it really queer and erotic, how much of retelling for you is like putting what you want into an original that was like almost perfect for you?
Yeah, I think that's, yes. Yeah, I think that, growing up, I grew up in a small town in Ohio, a small Christian town, and I didn't really have access to gay anything, gay literature, etc. So, I would read these kind of Gothic things or horror things, and I would feel the kind of otherness in them, and that excited me. I like that idea of the other. But I think now I want to put myself in that too. So I'm queering those things that I kind of felt were inherently queer in some way to begin with. Yeah.
Yeah, side note, I grew up in rural West Virginia and also moved to California.
Got it.
I get it.
Yes. You probably have that other feeling as well.
Yep.
So this is going to be our Halloween episode, which we're so excited about. So let's go to the other angle and talk about horror and its relationship to retellings for you and what it is about that, intersection.
So, well, for one, I'm a huge Halloween fan. I love Halloween so much. I have a calendar at my house. Basically, I was trying to plan one Halloween event every day in October, and it could be small, like watching a movie, or it could be big, like, going to a pumpkin patch or whatever.
That sounds like something I would do, Adam.
I love it so much. And, well, I love horror. I love horror because for me, horror has that ecstatic element to it where you feel like you can kind of be blown out of yourself. So I like to feel, like that kind of bigness that horror can give you, really extreme versions of horror. So I tried to capture that in Hound of the Baskervilles, because I think that, even the original gives me that feeling a bit, kind of the lonesome moors and the sound of the dog in the distance and the kind of darkness and all of this stuff. It gives you that kind of ecstatic feeling. But I wanted to turn up the volume on that to like a 10. And so that, I imbued it with, body horror and all kinds of, supernatural horror and things like that, where it really, I think, hits big.
And both of the stories of yours that I read are highly visual. And so how did that compare to the original stories? Yeah, I'm curious what that part of your process is like.
I think, when I write, I very much see the story in my mind. So it's a very visual experience for me. Oftentimes, when I stop writing, I can it's almost like looking backwards in my head, and I can see the characters waiting there for me in a scene, right? Like it's literally that, like it's a real place. I also think, I'll tell this part of the story. I haven't told anybody else this, but I'll tell it to you. Before I wrote this book, I had gone through kind of a bad breakup. And I had also discovered that I had low testosterone. And so I started taking a testosterone supplement. And prior to that, I had not been really dreaming for whatever reason. I had not been having dreams. When I started taking the testosterone supplement, I started to have really extreme, vivid dreams. And all of that kind of fell together, and I just suddenly had this idea for Hound of the Baskervilles in my mind. Like I knew what it would look like, and I knew that it was kind of like dark but bright at the same time, and all just the kind of like strangeness all came together from all of that, and it was just a really interesting experience.
So retellings in general, what has inspired you in the past? Are there any authors that you looked to when you were learning the process of retelling, a well-known tale in a new way?
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, I'm using the toys that Arthur Conan Doyle sets out. If you read his story and then my story, you will see interesting kind of echoes, right? They speak to each other, but my story is extremely different. So you know basically nothing about my story from reading his story. And I think that my favorite type of retelling, well, I don't know, like I like things like Wicked, where you have, you take the point of view of the Wicked Witch and you show the other side. But I also like something that really just like dements the original, that makes it so strange. I'm thinking about the filmmaker Guy Maddin, Canadian filmmaker, made a movie called My Winnipeg, which is awesome. But he also did this ballet version of Dracula. So it's this filmed kind of gritty black and white version of, Bram Stoker's Dracula. And it's just like, it's so cool to see it and so ecstatic as well. So I think that's the kind of thing that I want. I want such a heavy filter on the thing that it is still recognizable, but it just becomes so odd, right? And maybe it gives you something like, or at least it gives me something of the spiritual experience that I was having when reading the original. But it's very much a mix of like me, the artist, with like how I perceived the original version versus what the original version actually is. How about you? Do you guys have favorite retellings?
Not particularly, but right now I'm reading The Hacienda by Isabel Cañas, which is like a Mexican Revolution setting telling of Rebecca, and it's so awesome. It's so good. It's very like Mexican Gothic, but like less about more the other side of colonialism. It's really awesome. What about you, Jacqui?
Nothing's immediately coming to mind except that I was just in New York last week and we got to see Into the Woods on Broadway, and so that was really fun. That was all the fairy tale retellings crossing. But I would like to get into the genre more, and I really do enjoy just the retelling from a different character's point of view, and then also queering up stories and switching up protagonists. I think is really appealing to me.
Yeah. When you brought up fairy tales just now, it made me think about Angela Carter. Angela Carter's book, The Bloody Chamber, is one of my kind of like seminal texts for like inspiration. But basically, she retold a bunch of fairy tales in the most kind of like amazing and ornate way. So that's one I would check out if you're interested in like retellings.
So I've seen a lot of people complain on Twitter that marginalized authors will get a lot of feedback saying like, this has been done before. Like we have enough retellings of Beauty and the Beast or whatever it is. But they're like, yeah, but there isn't a Black one or there isn't a queer one or whatever. Did you experience that at all?
I haven't experienced that kind of feedback, but I will say I just don't imagine that we could have enough of those. I think that, again, these things they exist. And it is so much fun to manipulate them and modernize them, make them contemporary, make them speak in a contemporary way, make them say something new. And again, I think that echo is so fun, like how you can play off of the original, which obviously, the Hound of the Baskervilles having dated views of various things at this point. Well, how can you update them and how can you disrupt them? How can you explode them? So that to me is all very exciting. So I don't necessarily think that we could have enough of those.
Yeah, I just want to clarify. I agree with you. This is not feedback from me. This is things that people say they hear from agents and editors.
So I'd love to talk a little bit about your process, dive in a little deeper. So, you said that you see a lot in images and your characters are speaking to you, but what do the nuts and bolts of that look like when you first set out to write a story? Do you outline the entire thing? Do you just kind of work in the sections that call to you at the moment and then piece it all together? How does Adam McOmber write?
Yeah, I definitely don't outline it. So I can kind of speak to how Hound of the Baskervilles was written, which was unusual in terms of how I write usually. So we put it out on Kindle Vella, which is a kind of platform where you can put chapters of things out. So we put it out one chapter at a time. So when I started writing, I was really thinking about it chapter by chapter. And I think when we started publishing it, I had maybe 5 chapters written. And then I had to continue to write the chapters without necessarily being able to change things that I had written in the previous chapters, which was actually a super thrilling experience. Like usually you can go back and, delete, change a character, get rid of a character, those kinds of things. But I just had to continue working forward. And it was super thrilling. And I was nervous that it wouldn't come together, that it wouldn't work, and then of course, it did work. And I was like, wow, that's very cool. I don't know if I could ever do that again, actually. It was but eventually, for the actual published book, that's goes beyond Kindle Vella, I did go back and rewrite. So the Kindle Vella version is a different version than what you would get if you bought, the book version. I think the book version is better in the end, but the Kindle Vella version was super exciting, and I really loved having to sit down and essentially produce a chapter. So there is no plan. I'll often know something about the end when I start writing, because that helps me write kind of towards something. Otherwise, when you write, there's so many possible paths to take. It can be very frustrating, especially if you're, just making something up whole cloth. You kind of have to know in the general direction that you're going to go. But other than that, I like to surprise myself.
I'm curious more about Vella. Were you receiving feedback from readers as you were putting it out? And do you feel like that influenced the way you went about it?
I got feedback from my editor chapter by chapter. So he would edit the chapter and then, I would do a rewrite and then we would put it up. It wasn't, I don't feel like I got a lot of feedback from readers, though. That didn't have any influence on it. But just the editor and the few friends that I would allow to, my few literary friends that I allowed to read things, they were giving feedback. And I don't know, in terms of things kind of come out of my imagination, and it's hard for me to kind of change them according to the will of others. So I'm just like, well, no, that's it, I'm afraid. So that's kind of how I do it. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. So I'm curious what changed between the Kindle Vella version and the book version. Like, what did you learn?
Largely the story is intact. It's the same story, but I think that in places, as you guys know, you have to just enrich things, embellish things, get the sensory world there. And I think because I was writing quickly, sometimes the sensory world was not appearing as much as I wanted. So I think I more fully enhanced the sight, smell, sound, touch of the novel. And I think mainly it was just smoothing things out and making things connect properly, because when I was thinking about the Vella version, they were each very much like their own thing. And then when you start reading it in a book, you can finish a chapter and then move directly on to the next chapter. And you want a clear transition, a smooth transition. So a lot of it was just that, is making it feel very connected. Though obviously if you were reading it later on Kindle Vella, you could read it in the same way. But my experience as an author was that I was writing these, like, they weren't short stories exactly, but they felt like their own entity. And then we would post that and post the next one and post the next one.
That's really fascinating. It kind of sounds like my worst nightmare.
Honestly, it was scary. It was honestly scary, because really you don't like when you start writing a novel, you really don't know if you can finish the novel, right? You don't know if there will be enough. You don't know if you have the energy and the creative force. But this really actually made me think, well, okay, I have to finish it. I started it and I'm not just going to let this, fragment exist out there. So yeah, but it was scary.
Yeah, and if you're not an outliner, I don't write in a linear fashion. So that's really interesting if maybe that hadn't been your practice before, to suddenly have to write from beginning to end.
I am usually, when I'm writing a novel, I'm usually linear. So that actually is a good thing, I guess. But yes, because that would be really hard if I was writing it in a different order. But yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about the logistics of permission or legality? Do you have to wait until things are in the public domain before you expressly do a retelling?
Yes. Hound of the Baskervilles is in public domain. I am not the best at talking about that kind of stuff, honestly, but I know it is. So that is, you can use that kind of material. Yeah. But I think, you have to be careful, right, in terms of doing retellings. So, but again, I'm not the best with that info.
Do you maybe have resources for folks who are kind of trying to balance retelling versus plagiarism? Or just maybe not plagiarism, just knockoffs versus retelling.
No, yeah. I think that it kind of blurs together, right? If you think about the notion of fan fiction, I have a friend who loves Harry Potter fan fiction and reads it all the time, and fan fiction that makes, Harry and Draco gay, their boyfriends, whatever, those kinds of things. That is a version of a retelling, isn't it? And some people really, really enjoy that. And again, it's kind of playing with the toys of the world. I think that in order, I don't know, how to make it a retelling versus, I don't know. In my mind, I think it's about the self, and you have to be putting something authentic and true about you, about your own kind of lived experience. It has to go in there, and it has to illuminate the original in some way. And I think that's the thing that makes it literary. You're bringing something of that self, of your, your desire, your feelings, you're putting it inside of this machine and seeing what happens. So for me, that's part of, again, what's fun about that retelling.
I'll just chime in with a quick resource that I know, which is that if you want to check to see if a story is in the public domain, Project Gutenberg is a great resource. Whether you want to do a retelling or you just want to use a longer quote. I used so many Les Mis quotes in my first novel, and that was permissible because it was in the public domain. So that's a great way to check.
Yeah, another thing that's tricky is Arthur Conan Doyle has such great descriptions of Baskerville Hall, but you can't use any of those descriptions, right? So you have to come up with your own descriptions for Baskerville Hall. So that was exciting to try to do that. Yeah.
Can you talk a little more about that? What was that process for you, and other things like that? What did you shift? Where did you take permission to push setting or things other than character?
So I have this version of Well, it's all of, I think it's all of the novels of of Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes novels. And in the back, it has an appendix. And one of the appendices talks about what houses he might have used as the model for Baskerville Hall. So I did research on all of those houses, because then you can find all kinds of interesting, architectural elements and things like that. And you can look at pictures. So it's not merely borrowing from, the Conan Doyle text. You're looking at maybe what his text was that he was using, right? I have a similar thing. You can buy Bram Stoker's writing notes for Dracula, and it's amazing. It just shows you like all the research that he was doing, and then you can go back and do offshoots of that research. And so again, you're kind of making your own thing, but basing it on what they were looking at.
That's so cool. I do not write horror, but that makes me want to. Speaking of not writing horror, do you have any tips for people who are just starting out in the genre? Like, how do you make something scary? I know that's a huge question.
That is a hard question. Okay, so one thing that I notice that people will do when they're just starting out writing horror or science fiction or fantasy is they borrow too heavily on pre-existing tropes. So if I were going to write a vampire story, I would probably never use the word vampire. Or if I was going to write a werewolf story, I would never use the word werewolf. So I would say don't lean too heavily on the things that already exist, but feel like you have to figure out what it feels like to actually be that thing, to inhabit that thing, and then kind of write from the inside out. So I always write a very kind of psychological horror fiction. So you kind of try to like place yourself inside of that thing or in that environment, and then really feel your way into it, rather than coming from the outside in, like, oh, I'm going to tell a vampire story and it's going to be just like Twilight or something like that, right? That's very outside in. So it's the same kind of thing I was saying before. Like you have to kind of experience the self through that lens, and then that's what you put down on the page. How to make something scary is really tricky. I was just talking to a friend about Stephen King, Salem's Lot, and The Shining, and why those things are scary. And we were talking about how Stephen King is super good at describing dead people, and those can be actual dead people or the living dead. But if you think about like the woman in the bathtub in The Shining, or the boy who's floating outside the window in Salem's Lot, those kinds of things, they're so well described. And I think that we as humans can connect to them because we can imagine, being dead or seeing a dead person and what kind of like disturbing feeling that would give. And then if they move around, well, that's incredibly disturbing, right? So the author M.R. James, M.R. James, is one of my, he's a Victorian ghost story writer. He would write ghost stories for Christmas. He has some of the scariest descriptions of kind of dead things or otherworldly things. And I do think when I read Stephen King, especially in The Shining, I can see echoes of M.R. James. So I think one thing to do is really read things that scare you and try to take them apart and see, well, what is it that's actually in the description that is making this thing scary, right?
So can we go on a tiny little sentient places tangent, Adam?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So I wrote my critical thesis on sentient and interactive places as characters in horror and speculative fiction. And it's also a topic that Adam kind of plays with. So I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that topic and why do you think that calls to you?
So I really like folk horror, and that's F-O-L-K. It's hard to say folk horror. And folk horror, the environment, the natural environment is haunted in some way, right? There are things buried under the ground, or we have ancient stone circles, Stonehenge, and things like that. The past very much inhabits the present in folk horror. That really, really excites me. And I also love the idea of haunted houses. That's the same kind of thing, a sentient place. It is, you can walk into it. It's a physical space, but then there's something behind that, the scrim of reality, right? You can kind of like, if you could peer, behind the walls, you would see some kind of like intelligence there. And I think I like that partly because I feel like it's true. When you walk into an old house or when you walk into a ruin, I can feel the past there. And that feeling, it always excites me and it kind of creeps me out at the same time. Like I can feel almost like all the things that have happened there. I'm not saying that I have some kind of psychic connection to those things, but I can feel that kind of like the kind of something seeping out from the cracks. So yeah, I oftentimes will take a house or a landscape and I'll try to imbue it with that feeling in my own writing, right? The kind of layers. But what about you, Jacqui? I'd love to hear from you about that because you wrote about that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And for mine, I was trying to take that haunted house concept because that's what people are familiar with and then just zoom out to see who else is doing that well in science fiction and horror. And it was really fascinating because I was trying to select only places that were, objectively interacting back with their characters. Mm-hmm. And so there really are not a ton. But I did discover a few. One of my favorites, which I'll recommend to you, Adam, and we'll see if we keep all of this in the podcast, that I just loved was Follow Me to Ground by Sue Rainsford.
Oh, yeah.
And the ground itself is, a sentient character. And I think that it's similar to you where it calls to me because there's only so much history that a person can have lived through, but suddenly you're including, a place as a character and you have hundreds or thousands of years of, energy and experience and laying witness to things. And so I think that that's the big part of that fascinates me. And Octavia Butler does it a lot, I realize, like with her sentient spaceships. And other locations. And so that's really fun just to see. And then, of course, the Overlook Hotel.
Right. And I love the idea, too, with stories where it's not a ghost, like it's not a human thing that is haunting the place. It is the place itself that is doing the haunting, right? Those are my kind of favorite things. That idea that, that there's this intelligence inside of the house or inside of the landscape, and it isn't human. It's something beyond human, because I think the Overlook is like that, if we're talking about The Shining. It has ghosts in it, but it also has its own agenda, and that's super fun. So
I'm so glad I'm reading The Hacienda right now. I just put it in the chat because I think you would both really love it. It's exactly what you're talking about. So there's like a priest who does kind of have the sense, and he's like, oh, bad feelings get stuck in the house and I can feel them building up and they get evil. But then it kind of flips it and he's like, but this isn't that. This house, this is actually evil. It's so good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, is the house, channeling the motivations of others and acting on that, or does it have its own motivations? And it's hard to say, like, so you think of Hill House, and it's the characters differ on what they think and whether or not the house has its own motivations. And you as a reader are left being like, I don't actually have an answer. It could be.
Yeah. And that's exciting, right? It creates that feeling of slipperiness where you can't be sure, right? Is it just the house, the bad vibes of the house, or is it something more? Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned just the psychological horror and the body horror, which is what I really feel drawn to lately. And I think it really is that kind of untethered feeling in all of that makes something scary to me more than maybe a slasher flick or, traditional, what we think of as a culture when we think of horror. I think it's more that feeling of being out of control with body horror or psychological horror that I don't know, really speaks to me. So it's fun.
Yeah. Though I will say, speaking of the slasher, I just saw Halloween Ends, and I thought it was so beautiful. It's like a dark romance. I highly recommend it. It just gives all the feels. It's good.
Oh, that's great. Well, maybe since this is coming out on Halloween, we can do a fun little tangent. Do you all have any other, horror things that you recommend, either books or movies, this spooky season?
I have so many, it's hard to pick. Like that's such an intense question for me. I don't know, Becca, you have anything to start out with? Oh, you don't read horror.
I'm not
right.
like a huge horror reader or writer. I grew up like as a very anxious person, and I was like, I watched The Exorcist when I was 12 and was like, I don't need more to be afraid of. I'm already terrified of everything. But I have found, speaking of body horror, that since becoming a mother, and Jacqui, I don't know if you'll relate to this, like I have like connected more to like that very like physically vulnerable sense of I'm trying to think about how to articulate it. So I'm beginning my journey where I actually am like, I can see how it's, I don't know, come back to me.
I hear what you're saying, though. I feel like that's a big part of it for me is motherhood and then like having an autoimmune disease. And that's why body horror appeals to me is it really is cathartic in that sense of not necessarily always being in control of your own body. And, you know, isn't a pregnancy and motherhood and birth like the original body horror?
Being ripped apart, having like the boundaries between me and another body questioned. It's...
Yeah, and I think horror, that crosses a lot with dystopian, which is, you know, generally what I talk about, but in that it's going to be really cathartic for some readers and writers, and others just aren't going to want anything to do with it, and it's going to cause them a lot of anxiety. We're writing for people that enjoy these genres and find them cathartic to read.
Yeah. I'll recommend something fun for Halloween if the listeners want to approach it. It's called WNUF Halloween Special. And it's one of my favorite things. It's a filmmaker who basically made a newscast from the 1980s, and it looks just like a newscast from the 1980s. And they have a live investigation of a haunted house going on, during the newscast, and everything gets completely out of control. And it also comes complete with all these commercials from the 1980s, like they take commercial breaks and things. So WNUF Halloween Special, highly recommend. Super fun, like kind of obscure horror movie. Another great, I'm thinking a lot about babysitter horror recently, like where the babysitter is alone in the house. House of the Devil by Ty West. It's a movie by Ty West. It's a really great spin on the babysitter story.
Well, I'm curious, do you have a Hound of the Baskervilles handy? Would you be willing to share a reading with our audience?
I do. Okay, so I'm going to read to you, starts on page 68 in the book, and this is where Dr. Watson, who is essentially alone here, Sherlock Holmes is back in London. Watson has been sent ahead to do the investigation, and this is his first encounter with the Hound. So here we go. It's then I hear a sound from the bog, a long, low cry, mournful. It swells, rising finally to a howl. It is the same sound I heard last evening by the megalith, only this time it's much closer. Something rustles the sedges before me, and I know I must flee. I must find my way to the road, to safety. I spot a nearby island of firm ground and leap to it, avoiding the quicksand of the bog. I draw my pistol from my pocket. The cry comes again, a keening. I turn to look, and there in the mists I see. How do I describe it? It is not a dog, no. It is sometimes a dog, a large grayish hound with muscled flanks and a menacing jaw. But it will not hold its shape. Soon it is like a man, lean and strong with wiry hair. The man ambles on hands and feet, turning his head in the mist, left and then right, perhaps scenting the air, searching for prey. Now he has a doggish face, long muzzle, pointed ears, and even as I watch, the figure folds and changes once again, swelling and contracting like a lung. It is a rent in the air, a dark wound that opens and closes. I see a dog and a man inside the wound. I see two dogs. I see two men. They embrace. They are all tangled. They lift their heads and howl at the dead gray sky. I raise my pistol, trembling. The wound opens further, folding back its edges like lips, and the wound looks at me. Hound of the Baskervilles, hound of us all, eyes like dark fissures, holes that blot out the sky, then a ravening scream, and it runs like a dog and a man and a wound. howling, mad. I stumble backward, trying to flee, and suddenly I am no longer on the island. I am neck deep in the bog itself. I struggle, trying to find purchase in the peat, but the bog shifts, sucking at me, drawing me down. All firmness breaks away. Fetid water flows into my mouth, my nose. I cough and spit, but there is still more water, bitter taste, and I feel the shadow over me, god of hell, swelling and collapsing, jaws shining, eyes red. It stares down at me, old man and dying man, all alone, water in my mouth, water in my throat. I cry out, choking. Thank you.
That was awesome. Jacqui, I would like to try to answer your question again because I've been like kind of basking in it. What I was getting at is the horror that I've read lately is like not only body horror, but like motherhood specific body horror. So I would like to recommend The Need by Helen Phillips and also Night Bitch by Rachel Yoder. And I think what really
both
appeals...
fantastic. I read both as well.
Oh, and like felt both of them so viscerally. And I think like what really appealed to me about it is that I was finally able to like connect with them, connect with the genre, like not in a, oh, here's something else to be afraid of, but in like there are all these kind of like amorphous fears that come along with being a parent. And like, this gives me like a tangible face or like feel something tangible to like put those fears onto. It's not it's not like a blob. It's like, oh, I'm going to turn into a werewolf, not like I'm losing myself. So yes, right. Both of those I would recommend.
Yeah. And both so different. I feel like The Need was like very like psychological horror, dark. And then Night Bitch just has so much comedy, you know, mixed in with it. And also, you know, the visceral, like, I don't always want to be a mother. And sometimes I just want to be feral and run through the woods. And that's okay. I can still be a good mother and like, you know, be in touch with my primal side. Adam, thank you so much. I always feel this when someone I know has written a book and I read it first and then I get to hear them read it. Because, you know, sometimes we read a little differently and I love hearing your voice, you know, along with the story and just thank you.
Thanks, Jacqui.
Oh, so good. Oh, I was going to recommend on that thread with The Need and Night Bitch is The Book of X, which won the Shirley Jackson Award a few years ago. Oh. And I read that last semester and it, I think, has become my favorite book like of all time. So yes.
It's awesome. I love that book.
And then also short stories, if you're looking for short stories, Amelia Gray's Gut Shot, all short stories that are in the body horror genre. And the cover is just absolutely gorgeous. So just go look at the cover if you need to see some beautiful art. Well, we usually try to dive in, you know, just to writing practice in general, since everyone listening, you know, is most of us are indie writers. Can you just share, Adam, I know you're a wealth of information because you are a terrific advisor who I've gotten to experience firsthand, but just general writing resources in general that you turn to frequently and that you would recommend. It doesn't have to be horror or retelling specific. Just as a writer, what do you find yourself turning to?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, in terms of craft, I always go back to Janet Burroway's writing fiction. It's like the platonic ideal of the craft book. Like all other craft books kind of emanate from it, I always feel. And I actually, when I was writing or revising Jesus and John, which is the novel that came out before Hound of the Baskervilles, I went back and just reread that entire craft book, and it really does illuminate certain things. It will remind you of things you totally already know, but that you forget in the process of writing. And you need something like that to make you think, oh yeah, I do need like concrete physical detail here, those kinds of things. So I love that. I love also reading theory. and it can be cultural theory or whatever, but I feel like that really helps me expand my own imagination. So we are all kind of like limited with a set of our own thoughts and the places, the kind of paths our imagination always travels. But a great one for me in terms of horror is Mark Fisher's book called The Weird and the Eerie, where he basically goes through those two concepts, like what makes something weird and what makes something eerie. And he has really interesting discussions throughout. And many of the texts we've been talking about would fit into those concepts. But that to me allows me to think better about my own representations in my writing and like kind of how to do them better if I think about them through that kind of cultural lens. Yeah, so those are two things that I would recommend, just in terms of craft, but also expanding oneself by reading some theory and thinking about culture at large.
And I'll echo Mark Fisher's Weird and the Eerie, because I read that with you. And yeah, it was just really illuminating to help me kind of sort through what exactly I was trying to